Yeah, it's a short presentation, but then there'll be discussion. Is it recording? I can't tell.
Yep, recording.
Okay, thanks. So yes, I'd like to briefly introduce a discussion on a shared language that I think Andrew's talk was a very good introduction to this, because it made pretty clear what the utility of this would be. Having an intermediate sort of way to write down a model so that it can be shared between different backends. So the motivation, this was mentioned before, but I'll just go over it real quickly. Simplification of moving it between different modeling packages. So if you want to use different modeling package, the portability aspect of it is, there's sort of lots of aspects to that, sub aspects to that. I mean, when you make something like this, this tool that Andrew made, I mean, you can, that's sort of a community resource that can be shared between the different backends. Another tool that doesn't exist yet, but would be really useful and is probably really hard, is making a model builder, just because there are so many different types of model to be built. So that one's going to be a tricky user interface to build, or that's going to be a tricky bag of user interfaces to build. There's going to be a whole bunch of them. And then this also helps downstream when people publish. There were a couple times during the different talks that we had where people said, you know, well, I want to be able to put the model in my paper, right? I want to be able to say what the model was that I used. And if this is something that's in a format that's easily understood, how it's supposed to be digested and used in sort of a standard way, that helps with that particular problem. And it helps people, you know, if they want to, from the journal article, if they want to import that model and try the same result. So that's useful for reproducibility, which I think is important. What would the shared model language look like? It has to be a set of, it's just a set of definitions. This is just, we're writing down a dictionary. We have to make a vocabulary of terms and agree on what they mean. There's a couple of different ways we could do this. Right, you could make it agreed. You could write down names in a programming framework, so like Python or MATLAB. People have noticed that there are similar names for different. I mean, Slab is the class for all of these different packages that are written in Python. That's sort of a that one's an obvious one. There will be a name called Slab in one of these languages, but that could be a class or a function. And if you all agreed that we were going to write all of our models in Python, that is a shared basis. So you could say the name Slab will do the following things. And you write it in Python, and that's a shared interface. So that's certainly possible. That's not the way that's not the work that I haven't been working along that direction, and I'll show why here in a second. The other way is a set of shared names in a declarative format, which is sort of just more of a document. The model rendering isn't built into it. You have to have a separate engine. It has to be loaded into some kind of program in order to see your profile and see what's going on. And then one nice thing is that you can actually store it. If it's a reasonably simple structure, it can be stored in a lot of different ways. And so it can be passed around in whatever happens to be a convenient container for you. It could be stored as JSON or YAML. I mean, if it gets a lot of structure, then YAML starts to be inconvenient. But BSON or binary can be useful if you want. I had to do some gymnastics to get around the problem of writing down infinity, which doesn't exist in JSON. And then protobuf or a similar schema'd format. I didn't know what the right word was there. Schema'd isn't really a word, but a format that has a sort of a schema attached to it. These are very small and very fast, and they're used in a lot of places. So that's another option. But in general, what these all would share is that it's just a document. You just write down a description of your model. So code-based models is largely what we have now. We write down our models as a program, as a little script in a lot of these packages. There are a few of them that I noticed. Some of the earlier stuff that Mernal was working on at ChemMatCars. I noticed that they had basically within their program they were storing a declarative model. I thought that was really interesting. Like as part of as to maintain the state of their interface, the thing that they were keeping track of was basically a completely declarative model. If you have a code-based model, it's extensible. So power users have been doing this forever. You use a package and then decide, I don't like what the Slab class does. I'm going to write my own Slab class and stick it in my model. And suddenly you have a new Slab class that has new properties. So that's a power that you have when you write a code-based model. You can do basically anything. Python, from blank, import blank. There's a bunch of XKCDs about anti-gravity about this. The learning curve this is the downside. The learning curve is very steep. This is kind of how I got here, is that people keep complaining, you know, that I want to do reflectometry. I want to write a model. If I have to write a Python script, for some people this is easy. For a lot of people, it's not. If you say you need to write a Python script for a bunch of them, that's when everything shuts down. Like, I'm not going to do that. It's getting easier. There are some things to make it easier. If you open up VS Code or PyCharm or something, then if you've already loaded your refl1d or your refnx package, tab completion is your friend, right? You start typing a name and then it tells you all of the attributes of or whatever are available for that. What can help, and this is something we're trying to do but is really hard, is to just make a huge repository of examples. And if you have all of these, then it makes it less scary for people to say, look, you need to write a Python program, but here's one that's very similar to what you want to do. Just open it up and change what you need to change. And people are comfortable doing that, even if they don't really understand what the Python code does. For better or worse, people do that. And you can have tools for generating scripts. So I have a couple of these. Other people have a couple of these where you put some simple inputs in and it generates a Python code for you. What we get to after that is noticing that making a graphical model builder is hard, because going from a builder state like what Andrew McCluskey is doing, where you write down a model based on this, you generate classes from this. This is straightforward. It's a one-directional problem that's very easy. You can always go that direction. Taking a model that's been written down in a declarative way and going back into a builder state, or taking a model that's written as code and then going back to a builder state, is essentially impossible. You can't read a Python script and infer a model builder state from that typically, just because of the power of the Python code or the MATLAB code, because it can contain literally anything. So you can't, without running the Python code, you can't just read it and understand what the model is supposed to be. So that's a limitation. And then this is just a feature that we don't typically have because it's hard to do with these script-based models. Is a round trip to fitter is hard, and it would suddenly become easy if you had a declarative model. So if you send your model to your fitting program and you do a bunch of fits, what comes out the other end could be the same model, but just with updated parameters if you had a declarative model. And for Python programs, because of the fact that it's hard to read a Python program in and make changes to it and then spit it back out, because it's essentially infinite complexity, that's hard to do. So again, for declarative models, that part's easy. Making a graphical model builder is still hard because of reasons, but it's not hard because of that. This part of it is no longer hard. Reading the model, making a builder out of, like, recreating the builder states, showing a picture of what you've built from the model is no longer hard. It's still hard to teach users how to use it by hand. No one's going to write one of these complicated structures by hand, but hopefully this is kind of has to work in concert with there being tools for creating these things. And then the price that you pay is that the models are no longer extensible. You have to build a model out of the bag of parts that you have. So if you write a declarative model, that's what you have. You don't get to make anything new in your model. You have to use something that's defined. How do you choose? As it turns out, because we've done the script-based ones first, there's no reason to turn that off, right? So if you have a script-based system for generating models, if you also enable declarative models for your backend, then you don't have to turn off the ability to write Python scripts or MATLAB scripts to run. It's just so you could allow your users that need to still write scripts. All right, so without further ado, here's some terms that I've written sort of a draft definition for a model language. This is the fit problem is sort of the top level thing. That's the base class. You have to have a fit problem. That's the bag where you put everything. And then there's experiment is fit problems are inherently multi-fit problems. So it's multi-fitting, but a lot of times you'll just have one experiment in a fit problem. So that's easier than having two different classes, one for multi-fitting and one for single fitting. I mean, single fitting is just multi-fitting with one fit, so with one experiment in it. And then probe and stack is sort of the base class for every sample. Every sample is made up of a stack of things. That's either more stacks or slabs or things like that. So some of those are over here. And then if you want to, let me share this link in the chat. If you feel like going to this thing, you certainly can to see if you open it in Firefox. Someone earlier in the sessions pointed out that it'll show you a nice JSON view. So I'm going to use Firefox to look at this. has a little tree view. And then that's the end of this part. And now we're going to go, what do we do with this stuff? What's next? Who knows? So let me exit that. And let's look at this. So this is the actual JSON document that describes the schema that we would have. So here's all the definitions. Here's a description of the fit problem. It has properties. It is required to have at least one experiment, and it can have and it has constraints attached to it. So the models are made up of at least one experiment. So it has to be, it's hard to read these JSON schemas, but that's what that's saying there essentially. And then let me start with something that is going to be straightforward. Where's parameter in here? Here it is. So there's parameter. So this is, a numerical value that you pass around that you do stuff with. So it has different properties. It has an ID. This becomes important for if you're going to have link parameters and this sort of thing. You have to have some way of referring to it. It can be fixed or not, if it's going to be fittable. And then the value can actually be, there's one more layer of indirection down underneath it. It can either be a variable or an expression, or it can point to another parameter if it's an alias, or it can be a calculation. And calculation is kind of the best example that we have so far is the total thickness for a stack is something that is a well-known calculation. It can be documented what that means. And so if you have another parameter that wants to reference that, you just say, this is a calculation that's well-known how it works. And then another parameter can use that parameter's ID to link to it and say, there's some constraint related, like this layer has to be smaller than this total stack thickness. So that's kind of a detail. And then bounds, this is the same as everybody's parameter. They're upper and lower bounds. And then there's a distribution. And the distribution, so this is the prior basically for the parameter. The default is uniform, so it'll have an upper and lower bound, but it'll be flat in between. And it can be either uniform or normal. And we defined one more, but I didn't want to include it. I mean, in REFL1D, we also have this idea of sort of a soft bounded distribution. And but I didn't include that in this one. So that's a parameter. And then, obviously it refers to other definitions and refers to variable expression, et cetera. So let's follow it down to look at expression. I guess that's up. These aren't in any particular order. So an expression relates to other parameters. So it basically is parameter A, parameter B, and then it has an operation in between it, where the operation is one of a list of well-known operators. So as you can see, this is all predefined stuff. So you can make an expression between any two parameters. It can be any algebraic combination of parameters that you want, but you only get these operators, right? You get add, divide, subtract, and all these things that we typically use, right? And we would add stuff. I think error function is not one of the more common mathematical functions that's available in a math library, but obviously we use it a lot, so it's in here too. So that's, and then here are the different distributions. Uniform is just basically a placeholder saying with a definition of what that means to be a uniform distribution. Normal comes with a little bit more information. So if your parameter has a normal distribution, you also have to provide a standard deviation, a center of the distribution, and then, well, the type is, so this is, every one of these items has a type, and that's just for recreating it into a class structure later on. It's not really part of most JSON schema definitions, but for the case where you're going to reconstruct this into a code object, then having sort of a unique ID for each one of these, defining a type for each one of these objects is important. You could get away with just using the name, but that's not really a standard way to do it. And so it tells you which items are required, and that's the standard deviation and the mean. Basically, you can't have a normal distribution without defining the center and the width. So, I mean, that's kind of the flavor of how these schema documents work, but there's a whole bunch of definitions in here, and I don't know if you want to go over all of them right now, but that's sort of just a flavor of what's in there. This is actually complete enough to run a number of the models that we would have. Like I copied, this is the model that I ran in REFL1D, converted to one of these. So this is the one that I showed in the earlier talk. So this is the layers. It's made up of D2O. It's a slab, polymer slab, silicon oxide slab. And then those are all combined into a stack. Those are the layers of a stack. And then it has a defined intensity, which is a parameter, which is a variable. It has limits. it has bounds, and the distribution is uniform. So, I mean, I could literally reload this model from this format into REFL1D and run it, and it would give me, it's the same thing as the Python model that I showed everybody earlier. So I think I'm going to cut it off there and then start having a discussion just to let people ask questions.